The next category is Israel, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Israel, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. So now we have two additional countries in the mix, and all of these things in one way or another are connected, and there's a relationship between all of them. Why Turkey and why Saudi Arabia? Well, I want to back up just for a moment and explain to you something called a waqf. Okay, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, W-A-Q-F. Now there is a Jerusalem Waqf. Okay, there are waqfs in different parts of the Islamic world. So we'll just go through it. A waqf is an Islamic religious endowments organization, or a trust, if you will, best known for controlling and managing the current Islamic edifices on and around, in this case, the Temple Mount in the Old City of Jerusalem, which includes the Al-Aqsa Mosque that you see in all the pictures, and the Dome of the Rock, which is the gold-domed Islamic structure. It's a shrine that sits on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Today, the Jerusalem Waqf is controlled by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. If you didn't know, Jordan is known as the Hashemites, okay? The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So accordingly, the King of Jordan, he currently supplies all of the funding needed to operate the Waqf, which is in effect the civil administration for the holy site. So what all that means is that there is essentially an Islamic endowment or an Islamic trust that runs particular or controls or manages particular Islamic religious holy sites and kind of manages and governs them. In this instance, even though we're talking about Jerusalem and we're talking about the Temple Mount in the center of Jerusalem, which is Israel, you have the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and the King of Jordan essentially managing and controlling this Islamic holy site called the Dome of the Rock and that whole Temple Mount area in the center of Jerusalem. So Jordan actually manages it and funds a lot of the things that go on there. This is the most important piece of real estate on planet Earth. This is the place where the temple of God once stood. And one day, we believe biblically, there will be a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem sitting on that very location before Jesus Christ returns to earth. Now, in recent years, Turkey has been seeking to gain a foothold, traction, and importance in Jerusalem, and specifically in East Jerusalem, where you have a large Palestinian population, and on the Temple Mount. So what you have is Turkey trying to buy its way, and if you will, bribe its way into a position of authority and power in Jerusalem. Turkey is funding what they call heritage sites in East Jerusalem and around the Temple Mount, which is where this Waqf governs. Remember, it's governed by Jordan, but Jordan, in comparison to many of the other Middle Eastern nations, is relatively weak and doesn't have the same level of power and influence as some of the other Islamic nations do. Turkey, now stay with me, Turkey works together almost synergistically, almost as one with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood has as its agenda essentially creating an Islamic caliphate, a grouping of Islamic nations that are ruled as one governing Islamic body. So Turkey and the Muslim Brotherhood are seeking to gain a foothold in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. They are building heritage sites, and they're bringing in and paying for many of the Palestinians. Remember where the Palestinians live primarily? They're living in the West Bank, the western side of the Jordan River. So Turkey is paying for them to come to Jerusalem from those other outlying areas, especially young Palestinians, giving them nice things, showing them a nice time, and educating them at their Turkish heritage centers in East Jerusalem about the fact that Israel really is just occupying this area. This is really belonging to the Muslims. And so Turkey is trying to indoctrinate in the young Palestinians the idea of the need for revolution, to overthrow the occupying force of the Israelis and to instill Turkish influence and power and the Muslim Brotherhood in Jerusalem. So what is Turkey trying to do specifically on the Temple Mount? They're trying to buy their way into the Waqf by endowing, sending funds to gain more power and influence over the Temple Mount itself, the very location of the future temple of God that will be built in Jerusalem. Turkey wants a foothold. Why? Because Turkey and President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he wants to come down and take Jerusalem back. Remember the Ottoman Turkish Empire? They ran the whole area of the Middle East and Jerusalem, 1517 to 1917. They want it back again. This ties in amazingly with what the Bible has to say about the last days and the role of Turkey in the last days. Now, what is Israel trying to do and Jordan trying to do to counter Turkish influence in Jerusalem and on the Temple Mount? What is Israel trying to do? Israel is trying to woo Saudi Arabia into coming in and making major contributions and having a major say in what happens in the custodial management over the Temple Mount. Can you imagine? Here you have a Jewish Israeli entity asking the center of Islam, Mecca in Saudi Arabia, asking Saudi Arabia to come in. Why? Because they desperately want a counterbalance to the influence of what Turkey is trying to do in taking over this region for the Muslim Brotherhood. So you have these two opposing forces. Remember, this is very important for the future of biblical prophecy. Turkey in the north of Israel, Saudi Arabia to the south, they are avowed enemies. Turkey and Egypt also are avowed enemies. They don't like each other at all. So don't just chalk them all up and say, well, they're all Islamic, so they're all kind of in the same boat. They're not. Iran is very distinct. Turkey is very distinct. Saudi Arabia and Egypt are very distinct in terms of who they work with and their relationships. So there is a conflict, a big conflict between Turkey in the north and Saudi Arabia to the south. And Israel is trying to play that to their advantage to fend off Turkish advances to control major areas of Islamic Jerusalem and bring in the Saudis in order to create a counterbalance to that. Now, why would Israel be turning to the Saudis and feel that they're able to do that? To talk to the Saudis and say, hey, would you come in and try to have more influence on what happens on the Temple Mount in our capital city of Jerusalem? Because Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Arab states of Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, the area of the city of Dubai that you hear so much about in the news, those nations are working behind the scenes with Israel in amazing ways. Economically, technologically, and militarily. Why? Because they have a common enemy. And the common enemy is Iran. Iran. So Israel feels at liberty at this point to go to Saudi Arabia and say, will you come in? And Jordan is now changing its tune and saying, we're open to Saudi Arabia coming in to help us to manage the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. All of this is very important because as Israel continues into the future to work more and more potentially with the Saudis and those Gulf Arab states and potentially Egypt, I think that that is really setting up the chessboard for what we're going to see unfold in the last days. So be watching for all of those things. Those are the three areas that I think are very important for us to be watching today. And there's many interconnections between them and pressures being put to bear. So we need to be praying for the peace of Jerusalem. Ultimately, they will not realize that peace until Jesus Christ, the true Messiah, their true Messiah, returns as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So I hope that this Flashpoint report has been helpful for you. Thank you.